SAT that you probably have the most misinformation on. A lot of people will tell you, oh, you just follow this template, you can get a perfect score on the essay, no problem. And that's not exactly true. You know, some advice is good, some advice is bad. Telling a student that you can guarantee a 12 on the essay is not good advice. So instead, I'm going to focus on the things you need to know about the essay to get a solid score. I'm a really good writer. I write for a living, and I don't always get 12s on my essays. I more commonly get 10s and 11s, and obviously I get 12s. But the important thing to remember about the essay is that the way they grade the essay is very subjective, and they have a whole different sort of slew of people grading your essay. They have two different people reading it. Sometimes it's getting graded by a computer, which I'm not even going to get started on. But there's no way to consistently write a 12 essay, and that's an important point. So you really want to focus on the characteristics of a good essay versus the characteristics of a bad essay. And it's also really important to remember that you can get a really good writing score without a 12 on your essay. You can still get an 800 on your writing as long as you do well in your grammar without a 12 on your essay. You can get a 9 on your essay and still get an 800 if you have a really high grammar score. So it's really important to remember is that the essay does not make or break your writing score. It only accounts for about 30% of it. Okay, so here are some things that you need to know about the essay before we get started, and this is basic stuff. First of all, the essay graders know that you have 25 minutes to write the essay, so they're not expecting art, right? They're not expecting a brilliant, well-developed, flawless essay. They're expecting a 25-minute essay. So it's really something that's really important, and it sets the tone for the rest of this discussion. The second thing is you're being evaluated on 3 broad metrics, right? The first is quality of thought. It is, how good are your ideas? Do you take a sophisticated argument, or you just say yes or no, right? Clarity. Can you get your thoughts across clearly? Do you say what you mean? The graders would much prefer somebody who writes with vocabulary words that they're comfortable with and says clearly what they mean over somebody who says, who tries to include $10 words but doesn't use them perfectly, uses them imprecisely, and as a result the meaning is muddled. So when you're dealing with vocabulary, stick to words that you're comfortable with. So clarity is another second really important metric that they use. And the third is mechanics. And that's just basic. Do you have good grammar? You know, are spelling and grammar mistakes kept to a minimum? Do you follow the conventions of writing? How is your sentence structure and variety? So these are basic like things you learn in grade school kind of rules, which is unfortunate because you're probably used to typing nowadays, and most students are bad at writing by hand. But that's another important thing. Students often ask me like, do they get evaluated on handwriting? And I say only to the extent that they can understand what you're writing. If your handwriting is so bad that they can't understand what you're saying, then that gets to clarity, right? But they're not going to penalize you for not having the world's best handwriting, and they're also not going to penalize you for getting the occasional fact wrong. So if you say Columbus discovered America in 1493, they're not going to penalize you for that because that's not what you're being evaluated on. So those are 2 important things to remember. The third thing I want to remind you of, the third point, is that despite the evaluation guidelines, these 3 criteria that I just discussed, the essay scoring process is chaotic and unpredictable. I've had friends write brilliant essays, really, really good essays, and get 9s or 8s for some reason. I've written, so-so essays and gotten 10s and 12s and 10s, 11s, and 12s. So it's really hard to predict what you're going to get on the essay. It also is tied to a lot of things that shouldn't have any control over. For instance, I had a friend who wrote a really good essay but wrote really small, and as a result it looked short, but it was definitely 2 pages worth of writing, and he got a 9 on it when it was clearly a 12 essay. So there's a lot of sort of unpredictability, a lot of chaos in the essay scoring procedure. So don't stress out over it. Just try to get a good score. So that's the third point. All right. So let's walk through what you should be doing with your time. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to see the essay, and they're going to give you a whole page of text, right? They're going to give you instructions, they're going to give you reminders, and they'll give you a little boxed area, right, that has instructions, and then it gives you a little quote to think about, and then it gives you the actual question. First thing I want you to do is just ignore everything on the page except for the actual question. So in this case, is success generally the result of ability, hard work, or good fortune, right? That is all I want you to read on that page. Don't read anything else. And the reason I want you to do that is I want you to write an essay that is your own. If you read the quotes, you tend to write an essay that fulfills the quotes. That is, an essay that agrees with the quotes or sort of develops those ideas. If you don't read that, you'll write your own essay, which is good, right? It's what they really expect of you. So everything else is redundant, everything else is a waste of time. Just read that one sentence and then start planning your essay. Okay, so the next thing I want you to think about is I want you to interpret the question and define the terms in the question. So in this case, this question dealt with success. So you want to define success. You want to say what success means to you. For some people, it's personal fulfillment, raising a family. Other people, it is having a good career, one that gives them satisfaction. Another definition of success is wealth, right? You make a lot of money. So in order to answer the question compellingly, you need to define what ambiguous terms in the question actually mean. So that's really important. All right, so at this point you have started to think about what the question means to you. You probably haven't made up your mind on it yet, and you probably shouldn't have. Next, I want you to come up with examples. Now, examples are obviously the foundation of a good essay. You have to have good examples, and your examples must have certain characteristics. The first is they have to be appropriate, right? So in this case, they're asking about success. So you want to think about somebody who was successful or not successful to prove your argument either way, but don't think of somebody for whom success had no sort of real relevance. Let's say, I don't want you to write about, Stewie from Family Guy, right? He's a baby. Success hasn't been, part of his life yet. So when I say what I mean, don't use appropriate examples. Don't pick something that has no relevance to the particular topic. The next thing, I want you to use specific examples. And in this book, I provide some examples of examples that are too broad and should be revised. So I'll give you an example of one. So like if you're going to write about the Industrial Revolution, that's fine, but it's a bad example, right? You have to write about a specific portion of the Industrial Revolution. For instance, how the Industrial Revolution changed our standard of living. So that's more specific. If you want to write about the Iraq War, it's fine, as long as it's appropriate. But you can't write about the Iraq War, it's too big. You have to write about humanitarian crises that resulted from the Iraq War, or something else like that, right? Don't just write about the Iraq War. It's too big for your essay. So be sure to keep your examples specific, right? You don't want to make them so broad, because first of all, you're not going to be able to write compellingly about a broad example. What are you going to do, summarize the entire Iraq War? No, you got to be specific so that you can tell the details and then apply it in a specific way. The third is your example should be real, and that is, it's okay if they're fictional. That is, it's okay if you're using Shakespeare or Hemingway or whatever, but they shouldn't be things that you made up that morning, right? Don't talk about a friend of yours who struggled with success, because SAT graders they won't necessarily know that you're making it up, but it'll feel made up and it'll feel bad, and you tend to not be able to write compellingly about something that you just made up, which is why good writers don't publish their first drafts, right? So don't make stuff up. And try to get the details right if you're going to pick an example. That is, pick an example that you know a decent amount about. One of the funniest essays I've ever read was written by a student who was writing about Death of a Salesman, and the entire essay wrote about Willie Nelson, not Willie Loman. So just remember, keep your examples real, right? Now, the fourth thing you should remember is that as you're developing your body paragraphs, you should make sure that you provide your examples the appropriate level of detail. That is, assume that the reader doesn't know already about whatever example you're using. So again, in this book, you give you opportunities to write a bit about the example so that you have like a good 2 or 3 sentence summary already sort of queued up for a particular example that you like to use. I have a student who loves writing about I Know This Much Is True, which is a book that has a lot of themes and it works really well in a lot of contexts. And he has his 3 sentence summary of I Know This Much Is True down to a science, and he just sort of plops it in there and then develops it, right? So make sure you're providing the appropriate level of detail so that the reader knows what you're talking about. But keep it brief, right? Don't retell the entire story. Just stick to the relevant details. Fifth point that I want you to remember is that it's really important to tie your examples back to your thesis. Don't let the examples stand out on their own and say, boom, you have the examples, clearly my thesis is right. You have to tie your examples back to your thesis. That is, you have to explain why you chose these particular examples and how specifically they support your thesis, your argument. The next thing you should do is tie your examples to each other. I typically recommend using 2 examples. Find out what's similar or different about your 2 examples and provide some sort of transition in between the 2 examples so that the reader can see how they're related to each other. If you're going to use 3, that's fine. Just remember that it's really hard to develop 3 examples in 25 minutes. I never use 3 examples. And lastly, write a simple conclusion. Your conclusion is the least important part of your essay. It has to exist. The biggest issue that a lot of students have with their essays is they run out of time before writing a conclusion and the essay just sort of ends. So if you have a conclusion that exists, you're already ahead of a lot of students. But keep it simple. Reiterate your thesis. Get fancy if you like. Talk about sort of some other ideas you would explore if you had more time, but just get the conclusion down. It's not as important as the rest of the essay.